Have you ever looked back at a relationship and felt like something was deeply wrong, but couldn't quite explain why? Have you ever sat in silence after a conversation, with your chest apretado, your heart heavy, and a voice inside whispering, "That didn't feel like love"? Maybe you brushed it off. Maybe you told yourself you were overthinking, that they were just tired, stressed, distracted, but the feeling didn't leave, because deep down a part of you already knew the truth. What they called love was something else entirely, something far more calculated, something that had nothing to do with who you are and everything to do with what you could give. Most people don't realize they're being used until long after the damage is done. You don't see it at first. It starts with small things. You giving, them taking. You listening, them unloading. You showing up, them disappearing when it's your turn to fall apart. And in the name of love, you keep sacrificing pieces of yourself. You believe that the more you give, the more you'll be valued. But they're not loving you. They're feeding on you. You became their emotional crutch, their silent therapist, their savior. And every time you delivered, they reinforced your place. "You're amazing," they'd say. "I don't know what I'd do without you." And those words kept you hooked. Not because they were true, but because they were perfectly timed to keep you in line, to keep you useful. You weren't chosen because you were special. You were chosen because you were available, predictable, emotionally generous, and easy to manipulate. This is the wound no one wants to admit, because it makes you feel like a fool, like your kindness was a weakness, like your love was wasted. And that shame, that silent, aching shame, it's exactly what keeps you trapped. You keep playing the role because the alternative, facing the truth, hurts too much. So you stay. You love harder. You try to be even more understanding, more patient, more forgiving, thinking maybe this time they'll finally give you the same in return. But they won't, because they never intended to. Carl Jung once said that we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. That means the love you gave wasn't seen for what it was. It was filtered through their emptiness, their needs, their convenience. And instead of receiving it with care, they repurposed it into fuel for their own survival. You were not a partner. You were a function. And once you stop functioning, you become irrelevant. This kind of emotional exploitation doesn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It comes with, "I need you, and you're the only one who understands me." It comes with guilt, with silence when you don't comply, with withdrawal when you set a boundary, and it leaves you constantly questioning yourself. Was it really that bad? Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe I need to try harder. No, you've tried hard enough. You've bled enough. The problem isn't you being too much. It's them never being enough to begin with. The scariest part is that many of these people aren't even aware of what they're doing. They don't see themselves as users. In fact, they might even believe they love you. But their love is shaped by survival, not connection. They love how you make them feel, not who you are. And when that feeling fades, so does their presence. This is the brutal cycle of unconscious relationships. You pour your soul into someone who only opens their hands when they're empty. And the moment you ask for something in return, they vanish, or worse, they accuse you of being selfish. Here's something you may have never realized. You were trained to be used. By your upbringing. By a society that tells you your value is in how much you can give without asking for anything back. You were praised for being selfless, for always being there, for never complaining. But that's not strength. That's silent self-destruction. That's how people lose themselves piece by piece, day after day, in the name of a love that was never real to begin with. And the worst betrayal isn't what they did to you. It's what you did to yourself to keep them happy. The times you silenced your needs. The times you stayed up listening while no one ever asked how you were. The times you convinced yourself it was enough just to be needed, even when you were dying inside. That's the kind of pain that doesn't show on the surface. That's the pain that quietly eats away at your identity. If this message hit something deep inside you, don't leave in silence. Subscribe now and comment below. I finally see the truth. Your voice matters here. Jung believed that the unconscious is always trying to make itself heard. That your pain, your exhaustion, your emotional depletion, those are not signs of failure. They are messages, warnings, alarms going off inside your soul, begging you to wake up. And if you ignore them long enough, they will show up as anxiety, depression, numbness, or even physical illness. That's the cost of being used and calling it love. That's what happens when you betray yourself for people who wouldn't bleed a drop for you. But there's something powerful waiting for you beyond the illusion. And it begins the moment you stop begging to be seen. The moment you stop trying to prove your worth through service. The moment you say, I deserve to be chosen for who I am, not for what I offer. This is not about becoming cold. This is about becoming clear. Clear on who you are. Clear on what you need. Clear on who deserves access to your heart, and who only came to empty it. And once you gain that clarity, everything begins to shift. People start to fall away. But the right ones, the ones who see your soul, not just your usefulness, they start to appear too. But that comes later. First, you must face this pain, this grief, this rage. You must sit with the truth. They never loved you. They needed you. And then you must ask yourself the hardest question of all. Why was I so willing to confuse the two? Because that question is the beginning of freedom. And that freedom is where we go next. You didn't learn to love freely. You were trained to survive by pleasing. From a young age, you were rewarded not for being yourself, but for being agreeable, for staying quiet when you wanted to cry, for smiling when something inside you was breaking. You were told things like, don't make a scene, be good, don't talk back, and you obeyed. Because deep down, all you wanted was to feel safe, to feel wanted, to feel loved. But what they were really teaching you was to become someone people could use without resistance. They weren't preparing you for connection. They were preparing you for submission. That's the wound you carry into every relationship, the belief that love must be earned through sacrifice, and so you became what they wanted. Reliable, nice, calm, selfless. You became the one who always understands, always forgives, always shows up even when you're exhausted. And slowly, without even realizing it, you learned to tie your value to your usefulness. You told yourself that if you were just kind enough, patient enough, available enough, then finally someone would love you the way you love them. But they don't. Because the more you give from emptiness, the more you attract those who take without conscience. That's why you feel like you're always giving and no one's ever giving back. That's why you're tired all the time, emotionally drained, mentally heavy. It's not because you're weak. It's because you've been running on emotional credit for years, giving love like it's endless, hoping someone would finally notice you're running out. And they don't notice, because they were never looking at your soul. They were only looking at what you provide. You became a service, a solution, a shield. And somewhere along the way you forgot that love isn't supposed to feel like a transaction. The tragedy is that most people who end up in this cycle never even question it, because from the outside, you look like the perfect friend, the perfect partner, the perfect support system. People say you're so strong, so loyal, so understanding, and those compliments become your cage, because now, even when you're breaking, you feel like you have to keep performing the role, like you'll lose your worth if you stop, like you'll be abandoned if you ever say no. So you keep saying yes, even when it hurts, even when it kills something inside you. Carl Jung believed that the greatest form of manipulation isn't what others do to us. It's what we do to ourselves to be loved. You've been taught to betray your own needs in exchange for proximity, to silence your pain for a crumb of connection, to sacrifice your boundaries for the illusion of belonging. That's not love. That's emotional survival. And the longer you stay in that pattern, the more invisible you become to yourself. This is why you end up defending people who hurt you, why you keep saying, they didn't mean it, or they're just going through something, or it's not that bad. You're not just protecting them. You're protecting the version of yourself that feels needed when you stay. Because walking away doesn't just mean losing them. It means losing the identity you built around being there for everyone. It means admitting that the love you gave was never truly received. That's a kind of grief that's hard to face. But you need to face it, because every time you justify disrespect, you give people permission to keep hurting you. Every time you explain away their coldness, you send a message to your own heart. I don't matter enough to be treated better. And that message digs deeper than anything they ever said. That message becomes the way you see yourself. It becomes the reason you stay, the reason you try harder, the reason you abandon yourself again and again, hoping that one day someone won't leave. And the cruel irony is that the person who keeps leaving is you. There's a version of you inside that's screaming to be chosen, not for how much you endure, but simply for existing. That version doesn't want to be praised for how much you can handle. It wants to be seen before you collapse. That version is the part of your soul that's still intact, still hopeful, still waiting for you to come home. But you've been so busy trying to keep others from falling apart that you've ignored how broken you are inside. And now, the person who's always been there for everyone else doesn't know how to be there for themselves. Jung taught that the persona, the mask we wear to function in the world, is necessary, but it's also dangerous when we forget it's a mask. You've worn yours for so long that you started believing it was you, the strong one, the healer, the calm voice in the storm. But behind that persona is a human being who's tired, who's scared, who wants to scream but doesn't know how, who dreams of being held without having to earn it, who wants just once to fall apart and be met with love, not judgment. And maybe no one ever gave you that kind of love. Maybe that's why you try to create it for others, because you know how painful its absence is. But if you keep pouring yourself out for people who only drink when they're thirsty, you'll die of emotional dehydration. This is not drama. This is the reality of what happens when a soul is starved for too long. You were never meant to be everybody's safe space at the cost of your own sanity. You were never meant to be so selfless that you disappear. You were never meant to love others so hard that you forget what your own heartbeat sounds like. But here you are, and you're still here, which means a part of you is still waiting to be rescued. Not by them, by you. The next time you feel the need to say yes when you want to say no, I want you to pause. Just pause. Feel the ache in your chest, the tension in your jaw, the part of you that's exhausted but afraid to disappoint. That's the real you, begging to be acknowledged. That's the part you've been ignoring every time you silence your needs in the name of keeping someone else comfortable. And I know it's hard to change, because if you stop being who they expect, you might lose them. But if you keep being who you're not, you'll lose yourself. And one day when you've given everything and have nothing left, you'll realize the people you tried so hard to save never tried to save you, and that realization will break you, but it will also rebuild you. Because buried beneath the pleasing, the proving, the performing, there is someone who deserves love without needing to earn it. And in the next part, we're going to talk about exactly why the people who take from you don't need to raise their voice, threaten, or beg. Because they already know which buttons to push. They already know the version of you who will never say no. And until you meet that part of yourself with truth and protection, they'll keep using you, just like they always have. Let's talk about that next. They never had to raise their voice to control you. They didn't need to yell, manipulate through obvious threats, or force anything at all, because they knew something much more powerful than confrontation. They knew your emotional code. They knew what to say, when to say it, and most importantly, when to say nothing at all. It's in the silence that your guilt speaks the loudest. It's in their withdrawal that you start apologizing for things you didn't do. That's how deep their control goes. They didn't need to dominate the situation, they just needed to make you doubt your right to be upset. And once you're confused, you're compliant. That's the most dangerous kind of manipulation, the one that feels like nothing's wrong, while everything inside you is slowly unraveling. Because it never looks like abuse. It looks like someone who just needs space, someone who didn't mean it that way, someone who says, "You're too sensitive," just when your gut finally starts to speak up. And so you silence yourself again. You rationalize. You shrink. You bend yourself in half just to fit into a role that was never designed for the real you. Not because they asked you directly, but because you're terrified of losing even that illusion of connection. If you've ever been used and called it love, you're not alone. Hit subscribe and write in the comments. No more silence, I choose me. Let this be the start of your healing. And the truth is, they've studied you. Maybe not consciously, but enough to know what makes you tick. They've memorized your wounds not to heal them, but to keep you from noticing how they reopen them over and over. It's not about love. It was never about love. It was about emotional access. About having someone who always picks up, always shows up, always takes the blame. You became their security system, their backup plan, their emotional shock absorber. And here's the part that hurts the most. You let it happen. Not because you're weak, not because you're stupid, but because some part of you truly believed that this was what love looks like, that real love meant tolerance, that loyalty meant staying through pain, that compassion meant excusing behavior that left you empty every single time. So every time they crossed a line, you moved the line. You told yourself, it's not worth the fight. You told yourself, they had a rough childhood. They're under stress. They don't know what they're doing, but they do. They may not know it intellectually, but they know it energetically. They feel the power they have over you, and they use it. Carl Jung wrote extensively about projection, the way people unload their inner chaos onto others, unconsciously making them responsible for the emotions they can't regulate. But there's a side of projection people rarely talk about. It's not just about what they throw at you. It's about what you absorb because you're afraid to push it back. You've become the emotional landfill for people who don't know how to process their own lives. And every time you take their pain and hold it as your own, you send a message to yourself that your pain doesn't matter. You've normalized emotional exploitation. You've been conditioned to think that being the strong one means carrying other people's guilt, shame, rage, even their self-hatred. And the scary part is, sometimes, you feel like you need it. Like if you stop being their fixer, you lose your purpose. Like your identity is tied to how much you can absorb without breaking. But that's not identity. That's invisibility. That's the slow death of a person who was taught to exist only in service of other people's comfort. The manipulator doesn't need to tell you what to do. They just need to make you afraid of doing anything differently. And you've internalized that fear. You double-check your tone in texts. You replay every conversation in your head. You walk on eggshells not because they yelled, but because they went quiet. Because you could feel the shift, the drop in temperature, the energy that told you, you better fix this before they leave. And so, once again, you sacrifice yourself for the sake of peace. But peace built on silence is not peace. It's submission. And deep down, you know it. You can feel the difference between genuine safety and walking through emotional landmines, between someone who loves you and someone who needs to control the version of you that loves them most. But here's the catch. Every time you try to reclaim your space, your energy, your voice, they switch the script. Suddenly, you're the cold one. You're the distant one. You're not like you used to be. They'll say things like, you've changed, you're being unfair, or even worse, you're making me feel unsafe. And the moment you hear that, your old programming kicks in. You feel the urge to apologize, to explain, to soothe. And just like that, they're back in control. But ask yourself this, when did you become the one responsible for everyone else's emotional regulation? When did your boundaries become negotiable? When did your silence become their weapon? You didn't sign up for this. You signed up for love, for connection, for mutual support. But somewhere along the line, love turned into management. Support turned into survival. And now you're exhausted because carrying someone else's chaos without consent is not compassion. It's emotional slavery. Jung believed that a healthy psyche knows how to keep its energy contained. That real strength is not about holding everything. It's about knowing what to let go of. But you've been holding everything. Their moods, their expectations, their coldness, their silence, their guilt, their stories. And somewhere beneath all that weight, you've lost sight of your own story, of your own pain, of your own voice that's been whispering for years. Please stop letting them in. But how do you stop when your nervous system is wired to equate rejection with death? When the thought of someone being upset with you floods your body with shame? That's the real war. Not between you and them, but between the part of you that wants to survive by being agreeable and the part of you that's screaming to finally break free. And until you face that inner war, nothing will change, because the manipulator doesn't just manipulate your mind. They manipulate your history. They activate the parts of you that are still waiting for the love you never got. And once you become aware of that, the spell starts to break. You begin to see their words as patterns, their silence as tactics, their guilt trips as performances. And that's when you realize the entire dynamic wasn't about you. It was about their need for power disguised as emotional dependence. But now comes the hardest part, the part where you have to choose between being liked and being free, between maintaining the illusion and finally protecting your peace, between letting them in or closing the door for good. And in the next part, we'll talk about that door, about the moments when your soul screamed at you to leave and you stayed anyway, about the warning signs you ignored, about the excuses you made. Because understanding how the cycle started is important, but understanding why you keep it alive, that's where the real liberation begins. You knew something was wrong. You didn't want to believe it. But deep down, you felt it. That quiet discomfort in your chest after another conversation where you gave everything and got nothing back. That hollow silence after another moment where you excused their behavior, even though it chipped away at your self-respect. That ache in your stomach when they disappeared again, just when you needed someone to be there. You kept trying to convince yourself that it was temporary, that they would change, that things would go back to how they were in the beginning. But the truth is, the signs were always there. You just didn't want to see them. You told yourself it wasn't that bad, that everyone has flaws, that love means forgiveness. And while all of that can be true in a healthy relationship, that's not what this was. This wasn't a relationship built on growth or connection. This was an arrangement, one where your role was to give, absorb, tolerate, and theirs was to take, justify, disappear. You saw the pattern, but you stayed, not because you didn't know, but because you hoped. You hoped that if you just gave it more time, more patience, more understanding, they'd finally see your value. But they didn't. They weren't ignoring the signs, they were using them. They knew you'd stay. They knew your heart was wired to protect, to forgive, to give one more chance, again and again. So every time they hurt you and you didn't walk away, they learned one thing, that you would rather suffer quietly than risk being alone. And so they pushed further. They tested the limits. And each time you allowed it, they moved the boundary one step closer to your breaking point, and yet you justified it. You told yourself, it's just a phase. Or, they're struggling. Or, they just need someone to believe in them. But who believed in you? Who showed up when you were the one breaking? Who held you when you collapsed behind closed doors, pretending to be strong for everyone else? You convinced yourself that being the stable one made you valuable. But stability without support is just loneliness disguised as strength. Carl Jung wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And sometimes, the person avoiding their soul is you. You keep covering for others. You keep shielding them from consequences. You keep absorbing the impact so they never have to feel the weight of what they've done. But while you're protecting them, who's protecting you? No one. And that's the bitter truth that cracks you open from the inside. You've spent so long carrying both sides of the relationship, managing their moods, their silence, their distance, their mess, that you've lost sight of the most important question. Who's showing up for you? Who asks how you are without needing something in return? Who sits with your pain, not because you're useful, but because they actually care? The truth is, when someone loves you, they show up. Not just when it's convenient, not just when they're lonely, not just when they need to borrow your light because they've dimmed their own. They show up because your presence matters. Not your performance, but you stayed. Because you needed the illusion. You needed to believe that all the pain had meaning, that all the giving would eventually lead to something beautiful, that maybe, just maybe, if you held on long enough, they'd become who you saw in them. But that person only existed in your mind. You didn't love them. You loved their potential. You loved the idea of who they could become. You fell in love with the story, not the reality. And that's not a weakness. That's the side effect of having a big heart in a world that keeps shrinking yours. They didn't change. You just stopped ignoring the truth. You stopped gaslighting yourself into staying in a place that was slowly draining your life. And maybe you haven't left physically yet. Maybe you're still there, still replying, still hoping. But inside, you feel it. The beginning of the end. The shift where your body stops flinching to their absence. The moment where your silence starts to feel like safety instead of punishment. Because what really hurts isn't what they did. What hurts is that you saw it all and stayed anyway. You watched yourself slowly disappear in the name of love. You gave away your boundaries, your peace, your voice, right? All for the chance to be chosen by someone who never really chose you. And now the grief isn't just about losing them. It's about losing the parts of yourself you abandoned to keep the relationship alive. Jung believed that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. That means this pattern of seeing the signs, of ignoring the warnings, of staying when everything in your body is screaming to leave. It's not just about this person. It's about all the places in your past where love came with conditions, where worth was measured by how much pain you could tolerate, where presence was earned, not given. And until you break that pattern, you'll keep bleeding for people who only show up to watch you bleed. But now, you're beginning to wake up. You're beginning to question the rules you never agreed to. You're starting to realize that the pain of letting go is smaller than the pain of staying, that love shouldn't require you to betray yourself, that being needed isn't the same as being loved, and that silence, your silence, can finally become a shield instead of a sentence. This wasn't just a video, it was a wake-up call. If it opened your eyes, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. I'm done being useful. I'm ready to be whole. Your story deserves to be heard, because when you start listening to that inner voice and the one you silenced every time they needed you more than you needed yourself, something changes. The guilt starts to fade. The fog starts to lift. You begin to see things for what they are, not what you hoped they'd become. And in that clarity, you find something terrifying and liberating. You never really had them. You had their need. You had their emptiness. You had their dependence. But you never had their love. And what you decide to do with that truth will determine whether you stay trapped in the cycle or finally break free from it. Because what's coming next isn't just about surviving, it's about reclaiming. And in the next part, we'll dive into that final realization, the one that makes everything snap into focus. You weren't loved, you were functional, and that's why they never stayed when you stopped serving a purpose. Let's talk about that next. They didn't love you, they used you. And the sooner you let that truth sink into your bones, the sooner you'll stop bleeding for people who only came into your life with empty hands and open mouths. Because that's what you were to them. A source, a resource, something that made them feel full while slowly draining you dry. You weren't chosen because of who you are. You were tolerated because of what you could provide. And the moment you stopped providing, the illusion shattered. And so did you. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Realizing that everything you thought was love was actually a strategy, that you were never truly seen, just scanned. They looked at you and didn't think this person is special. They thought this person is safe. This person will say yes. This person will bend. And you did. Again and again. You bent until the shape of you was unrecognizable. And even then, they asked for more. Not because they needed it, but because they knew you wouldn't say no. And the more available you became, the less they respected you. The more you showed up, the more invisible you became. Because people don't value what they don't have to earn. And you were there, always there, answering every message, soothing every insecurity, taking every blow and calling it loyalty. But here's the truth no one tells you. Love doesn't require your destruction. It never has. You kept thinking that if you gave enough, they'd finally choose you. That if you were understanding, patient, selfless, someone would finally stay. But they didn't stay. Not when you needed them. Not when you broke. Not when you stopped being useful. Because what they were attached to wasn't your soul. It was your silence, your presence, your energy, your willingness to be less so they could be more. Carl Jung warned us that the greatest damage often comes from what we refuse to confront. And what you've been refusing to confront is that being used feels familiar. That somewhere along the way, you were taught that love means sacrifice, that your needs are secondary, that you are lovable only when you're giving something. So you became a giver, not out of abundance but out of fear, out of conditioning, out of the quiet desperation to finally feel like enough. But you were never not enough. You were just surrounded by people who made you feel like you had to earn their bare minimum. People who disappeared the moment you stopped performing. People who were never really there, just orbiting your light, waiting for their next fix of comfort and validation. And when you finally started to dim that light to protect your peace, they panicked. Not because they missed you, but because they missed what you did for them. So you need to hear this now as clearly as possible. You don't owe anyone your emotional availability just because they're used to draining it. You are not selfish for pulling away. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. You are not broken for choosing yourself. You are finally stepping out of the role they wrote for you and into the identity you were always meant to claim. Someone who doesn't have to shatter to be loved. And yes, it will be uncomfortable at first. You will feel guilty. You will question everything. You will hear the voices of your past telling you that love means staying, that kindness means tolerance, that abandonment is the price you pay for having needs. But they were wrong. That was never love. That was emotional control dressed as connection. That was neediness disguised as intimacy. That was trauma bonding, not truth. And now, you have a choice. You can keep playing the role. Keep showing up. Keep betraying yourself a little more every day in exchange for crumbs of attention from people who will never see you clearly. Or, you can walk away. You can stop answering the messages, stop explaining yourself, stop accepting half love in the hope that it will turn into something whole. Because it won't. It never has. You deserve the kind of love that doesn't ask you to vanish to be accepted. You deserve to be heard without having to scream, seen without having to perform, loved without having to break yourself into pieces just to fit someone else's comfort zone. You deserve reciprocity, safety, consistency, and none of that will come from the people who only knew how to use you. But it can come from you, from the way you speak to yourself, from the boundaries you hold, from the silence you choose when chaos tries to drag you back in, from the courage it takes to say, I matter too. That's where healing starts. Not with revenge, not with proving anything, but with release, with walking away from the need to be needed and walking toward the need to be whole. Jung once said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. And now it's your turn to choose, not to become cold or hardened or bitter, but to become real, to become rooted, to become unavailable to anyone who only comes with a need and not with love. And if this journey has stirred something in you, if your chest feels heavy, your throat tight, your heart cracked open, it means you're ready. Ready to step out of their story, ready to write your own, ready to stop begging for love and start becoming the source of it. Not for them, not for anyone else, but for you. Thank you for walking this path with me. Thank you for surviving long enough to come home to yourself. Thank you for choosing your peace over their comfort. And if this message reached your soul, let me know in the comments with just 3 words. I choose me. Because today that's where your power begins, and this time you won't give it away.